If you've ever heard the term consideration in the context of mergers and acquisitions, consideration is what the bidding company pays for the target company. And there's several different types of consideration in a merger. You could have an all-cash deal where the bidding company pays for the target either with just cash it already has on hand, or they go out and borrow money. So it's debt finance. They go and they borrow money to acquire the target company. But the merger could also be financed where you don't have any cash at all. Instead, the merger could be financed with securities. Okay, so it could be debt securities or equity securities that the bidding company is paying in order to acquire this target company. Now, if we're talking about equity securities, could be common stock, could be preferred stock. So if you hear about a stock deal in a merger, very frequently it is common stock. The bidding company is issuing or giving away some of its common stock to acquire the target company. Or you could have a combination. You could have where there's 50% cash and 50% common stock in order to acquire the target company. So I'm going to go through this in a little bit more detail, particularly with the stock acquisition, because this could be complicated, and it gets down to whether we're going to have a fixed or a floating exchange ratio. Let me explain what I mean by that. So if you are doing a stock deal, if you're the bidding company, you could offer a set number of shares. You could say, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I will pay 20 million shares to acquire this target firm. Okay, so then it's just the number of shares is set. It's just 20 million. That's the end of the story. Okay, so that's called a fixed exchange ratio. Now you say, well, that's pretty simple. You're just offering 20 million of shares in your own company to acquire this other company. But here's where it gets a little more complicated. In some cases, you have what's called a floating exchange ratio, where you're not having a fixed amount of shares. You're not saying, oh, well, there's going to be 20 million shares. That's what I'm going to pay. But there's a dollar value that's set. You say, okay, well, instead of saying I'm going to pay 20 million shares, instead, what I say is I'm going to pay $10 billion worth of our shares that we're going to give. Now, the question is, well, how do we compute what is the 10 billion? Now, how many shares is that going to be? How many is 10 billion worth of shares? And commonly, the way it's done is this. So we've got this formula here. This would be useful for you. But basically, we have this thing called the pricing period. And we say, okay, when we're figuring out how much is 10 billion of the bidder's shares, we might say, okay, over this 2-month period, what is the average share price of the bidder's stock during this time period here? Okay, so this would be the pricing period, this time period, the 2 months. So we take their average stock price during that time period, okay, and then the value of the stock being offered, well, that's just the 10 billion. Okay, so that's the 10 billion. So let's say that here our denominator was $400 a share. Okay, let's say that's what it was during the pricing period. And we say, okay, well, they offered $10 billion worth of their own shares. And given that there's a $400 price per share of the bidder shares during that time period, if we use our formula, we get to 25 million shares. Okay? 25 million shares. So that's what the bidder, by saying, look, we're going to pay 10 billion of shares, and then if it turns out during the pricing period that it's okay, $400 a share, then they are basically offered, they're going to end up paying 25 million shares to acquire this target. Now, so it can get more complicated. Sometimes we have a thing called a collar. A collar would be used with this floating exchange ratio that we just had, where we say, okay, there's the average stock price over this time period, and there's a set value of the stock, and we have to calculate this. It could be worked out in the deal where we say, okay, there's going to be a set floor or a ceiling in terms of, maybe we say, okay, look, yeah, we're going to calculate it like this, but in no case will it be fewer than 20 million shares, and in no case would it be more than 30 million shares. So you'd say like it's capped. It's like between 20 and 30. Like it could float between there, but it's not going to go below 20 and it's not going to go over 30. So that would be called a collar. So you can see this is pretty complex. We're just talking about, they offer a certain amount to acquire this target. If it's a stock deal, it can get very complicated. Now, a final note here, and this applies not just to stock deals, but to all cash, combination, whatever. It doesn't matter. When there's a merger, the price. So if you hear like, oh, this company A offered $14 billion to this other, they want to acquire this other firm and merge. Okay, so that price even though you just hear this number and you think, oh, that's fixed, it might not be fixed. It could also be variable. Okay. So I just say, how do you explain this? Well, there could be a contingency in the bidder's offer. Okay, sometimes there's a discrepancy. So let's say we've got one company. So we got company A, and they want to merge with company B. And company A says, you know what? I think company B is worth $100 million. And company B says, no, get out of town. We're worth $200 million. We're not worth $100 million. And so you've got this argument. You've got this argument between the firms over what company B is worth. So what they could do is they could structure the deal where they say, listen, I have this thing called an earnout. And an earnout says, look, okay, so to the seller, if you all think that this thing is really worth $200 million, I'll tell you what, if your earnings per share is at least $10 a share next quarter or next year, if we meet some kind of earnings per share target, or EBITDA, if we say the EBITDA reaches a certain threshold, then okay, we'll give you an extra $100 million. Like, so the basic deal will be to acquire B for $100 million, but if B's EBITDA reaches some threshold next year, we'll kick in an extra $100 million, so then it will be $200 million. It's kind of like, look, we've got a discrepancy of the price, so we'll have some base price, but then if you reach a certain financial goal, we will give the seller more money to compensate for that. Okay, so now, a related thing, contingent value rights are the similar idea of, okay, there's a contingency if something happens, but it's not necessarily a financial goal. It could be, if we're talking about maybe B, maybe the target, company B, is a pharmaceutical company, and they have some drug that has potential to be a blockbuster drug, but it hasn't been approved yet. And so company A, the bidder, says, well, listen, if company B's drug, if that drug gets approved, if this certain event occurs, the drug approval, if that gets approved, then we'll kick in an extra $150 million. So we see that they say, okay, there's a price that we're going to pay in terms of what we're offering for the target, but if the target hits a certain financial goal, or if some event happens, a drug gets approved, something good happens, then it could be more money that end up being paid as a consideration.